सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
In this season of one distraction every day, it was one nation, one election once, and then it was Bharat versus India. I've been searching for something new to talk about today. And while searching that, I noticed something. I noticed something about Pakistan. And it's not about Pakistan politics right now. It's not about Pakistan economy right now, although Pakistan's rupee has again taken a tumble. It has broken the 300 rupee to a dollar mark. But that is not the story. The story is that today is 6th September. Now 6th September, we know that our 22-day war with Pakistan was fought in 1965 in the month of September. So we consider that war, we count that war from the 1st of September to the 22nd of September. The Pakistanis, on the other hand, mark a particular date in that war as Defense of Pakistan Day. That is 6th of September and that is today. So I saw on social media two trends. One trend is hashtag Defense of Pakistan Day and second is hashtag Defeat of Pakistan Day. Now you can see who put out Defense of Pakistan Day, obviously the Pakistani side, and who's putting out the Defeat of Pakistan Day. That is people fighting back, or Twitter warriors or ex-warriors fighting back from the Indian side. It was also a day when Pakistani army faced an attack from TTP, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, on their western frontier. The important thing, however, is I thought that this is a good time for us to look at the business of military mythologies, because after all, it is a mythology that September 6 is observed in Pakistan as Defense of Pakistan Day. Now, this is irrespective of what might be your view on what happened in that war. In that war, almost 6 decades ago, right? The important thing is that the Pakistanis call it Defense of Pakistan Day, which is counterfactual, because that's a war that Pakistan started. That's a war that Pakistan launched. Pakistan had an objective, that was to capture Kashmir. It was Pakistan's last chance to capture Kashmir militarily, as military historians say, but they fully failed in their objectives. In 22 days, a stalemate was achieved by both sides. Both sides were a bit punch drunk by then and didn't have much firepower left. And both sides were then, at that point, relieved with the ceasefire, and that led to the Tashkent Agreement, etc., etc. Now, the larger assessment of that war 58 years ago, that we dealt with in episode 259 of Cut The Clutter, which was headlined The War of Mutual Incompetence. And in that episode, of which I'll share a link with you, we can see why we call it a war of mutual incompetence. The Pakistanis, on the other hand, celebrate this day not as a victory day, because they are the ones who had launched a war. Now, why do they call it Defense of Pakistan Day? Or why do they call the war the Defense of Pakistan War? Although their textbooks will tell you they won the war, they did not. If anything, they lost the war to the extent that they are the only ones who had an objective, and that objective was not achieved. India's objective, if anything, was to defend itself, because India did not start that war. September 6 is something that Pakistanis particularly hold dear to them, because that is the day that Indian Air Force launched multiple waves of attacks, multiple waves of very courageous and, I would say, also quite chaotic attacks on Sargodha airbase, or what is called as the Sargodha complex, bunch of air bases and Air Force installations which were among the most heavily defended, or probably the most heavily defended in the subcontinent at that time. And in those attacks, Indian Air Force suffered a bunch of casualties. A lot of the ordnance was delivered, it was dropped on the air bases, but Indian Air Force also suffered a bunch of casualties. Around that, the Pakistanis built a whole mythology, including of somebody shooting down 6 aircraft or 5 aircraft in 30 seconds or 25 seconds, etc. And those mythologies endure. It is that day because Pakistan did not win that war and they have nothing to show, nothing to prove that they actually won the war or achieved any of the objectives. They observe this day as Defense of Pakistan Day. Now, the Pakistani textbooks from class 3 onwards, in fact, I once wrote a story about Pakistani school textbooks on their treatment of the India-Pakistan relations, on their treatment of India-Pakistan wars, which, by the way, they call Bharat-Pakistan wars. Bharat is the preferred usage for India in the conservative Pakistani system because of the old belief that India as it existed in history ceased to exist with the partition of the subcontinent, and if India continued on with the name India, and that is also the objection that Muhammad Ali Jinnah had to India being called India, is that India will then be seen as the successor state of the British Empire, whereas Pakistan will be seen as the seceding state. So Pakistani textbooks have all these chapters as Bharat-Pakistan wars. Now, they heavily lean on Pakistan Air Force's performance in the 1965 war. Now, the fact is that if you look at history written from the Pakistani side, there was a famous writer or infamous writer in India called John Fricker, who the Pakistani Air Force always patronized to write their side of the history. And there were also Indian historians and chroniclers who talked about that war and who also talked about the subsequent air war also, the 2 air wars, who've given their accounts. So if you read all those accounts, it is true that in 1965, Pakistan Air Force was much better equipped. They were in the missile age, they were in the supersonic age, they could fly at night, they could fire at night. Indian Air Force was still a work in progress. So Pakistan Air Force actually performed quite well in that war, but the fact is that did not win them the war. Now, both sides built mythologies. Pakistanis built their own mythology, superiority of the saber, 5 or 6 IAF aircraft shot down by one pilot in 30 seconds over Sargodha. At the same time, we Indians built our own mythologies and stories, the superiority of the NAT, the fact or the idea that the Pakistani saber pilots actually avoided combat with the NAT. There was some truth on what each side was saying, but neither side was speaking the whole truth. Truth in the course of time kept on coming out as it did many years ago, or more than a decade ago, in a story that Manu Pabbi, my former colleague, he now works at the Economic Times, he did for the Indian Express while I worked there. That story was about a note of regret that a Pakistan Air Force fighter pilot sent out to the daughter of a distinguished Indian pilot, a distinguished civilian Indian pilot, whose defenseless civilian transport aircraft he shot down on the last day of 22-day war. The Pakistani pilot's note was unusual, as such sentiments are not usually expressed in this perennially hostile relationship of ours. Even if the hint of regret in this letter, if any, was entirely qualified. In brief, on the last day of the pointless war of attrition, or rather a war of competitive military incompetence, a Beechcraft, a civilian Beechcraft owned by the Gujarat government, was shot down by a Pakistani saber jet in Gujarat, deep inside Indian territory. Its 8 unfortunate occupants, all civilian, besides the crew and a Gujarat Samachar reporter, included then Gujarat Chief Minister Balwant Rai Mehta and his wife. Now, Mehta, a Congress stalwart, highly respected in the country, he became the first and only politician ever to be killed in wartime action in the subcontinent. The note of the Pakistani pilot then, Qais Hussain, it gave us a chance then of revisiting a question that has never been debated freely in India. That question is, and I am revisiting that question today, that question is just how well or poorly did the Indian Air Force or IAF do in the War of 1965? For nearly 60 years now, India has nurtured a mythology consciously constructed during and in the aftermath of that war, the mythology of the Indian superiority in the air, of the little gnat's invincibility, and so on. This letter by the Pakistani pilot actually attacked a carefully cultivated Indian story of the air war of 1965. Similarly, many stories would be found on the Indian side questioning the Pakistani story or Pakistani history of the 1965 air war. The most important of which is that if 6th September 1965 was the day when Pakistan Air Force delivered such a humongous decisive punch against the Indian Air Force, how come they didn't win the war? How come they didn't win the war? No such thing happened. No such decisive thing happened in that war. And definitely no such decisive blow was delivered by anybody in that war from either side. The reason we are talking about this is that military history is serious business. It is also brutal because not only is the early history mostly written by the winner, which none was in 1965 overall, it also rarely resembles the purple prose of the gallantry citations. The simple question is, what kind of control over our own airspace did we Indians have, that a PAF Sabre, Pakistan Air Force Sabre, was loitering deep inside our territory and shot down a civilian VVIP aircraft? Of course, no Air Force can guarantee that not even a single enemy aircraft would be able to enter its airspace unchallenged. But nearly 6 decades after that inconclusive war, there is no harm in taking a more robust and questioning view of what exactly happened then in the air and of how we were able to create such a fictional history afterwards. Because we are a democracy, we are a powerful country. At this point, we have left the Pakistanis way behind economically, in our technological prowess, and also militarily. So we can look at our history more honestly, even as the Pakistanis continue to perpetuate the same convenient mythologies and fictions. If we fought that war in the air as well as we believe, or we've been made to believe, how come we lost 75 aircraft to Pakistan's 28? These are documented figures. And I will tell you where. Indian sources, not Pakistani sources or not so-called Western sources. As many as 37 of our losses were on the ground in that war, compared with 8 of the PAF, as claimed to have been destroyed by us. This only underlines the fact that the PAF did a much better job of attacking rival air bases, our air bases, than we did of theirs. On the very first day of that war, since the context is the air war, and since the context is Pakistan's continued perpetuation of the idea that because they did better in the air in 1965, they won the entire war. They did not win anything in that war. We must revisit the facts of that war. On the very first day of that war, the IAF opened the campaign losing all 4 of the Vampires, then possibly the slowest moving jet fighter in the world. These 4 were sent out to help our beleaguered army units in Champ. Why these totally vulnerable and by then not combat-worthy aircraft were sent out when better options were available is not a question that has been asked often enough by our military historians. This was followed by 3 other disasters that set the IAF back rudely in that war. 3 days into the war, on September 6, the same day that the Pakistanis observe as their Defense of Pakistan Day, 8 Pakistan Air Force Sabres attacked the Pathankot Air Base, bristling with combat activity. Pathankot Air Base was bristling with combat activity, and yet these Pakistani aircraft were able to break in. That highly successful 8 Sabre Pakistani raid, by the way, was led by Arshad Sami Khan, whose son we know well in India, Adnan Sami the singer. The Pathankot base commander somehow ignored even warnings from Amritsar radar conveyed over the phone to them, and neither scrambled fighters, although they had many on call, nor dispersed aircraft on the ground. The Sabres fired unchallenged, and India lost 10 aircraft on the ground that day, including 2 of our most wanted MiG-21s. And I will tell you a story about that as we go along. We had only 9 MiG-21s by that time. Our first supersonic squadron was still forming. 2 of them were blown up in that raid on the ground in Pathankot. This loss of 10 aircraft on the ground in Pathankot was then followed by another 10 in World War II style brave but chaotic raids over Sargodha. The Pakistanis, of course, as you would expect, made highly exaggerated claims, and that's how September 6, which is the day today, came to be observed as Defense of Pakistan Day and also an occasion for triumphal military parades. But the fact is that on this day, the IAF suffered severe losses, followed by more self-inflicted through command indecision losses on the ground as the PAF attacked our eastern airfields. It is now a well-documented fact by non-official historians that the IAF had planned pulverizing raids on the Pakistani Air Force bases in the eastern sector, and it had even launched fully loaded aircraft which were called back when they had the targets in their bomb sites. And Delhi got nervous about irritating the Chinese. The PAF Sabres then came more or less on the tail of the returning IAF air formations, hitting almost all the major IAF bases in the east, particularly in West Bengal, that is Kalaikunda, Bagdogra, etc. Surely, the IAF did much in subsequent days to restore the balance. Its gallant defense of Halwada and Adhampur in Punjab resulted in the Pakistan Air Force stopping daylight raids anywhere on IAF air bases, for example. Some of its NAT and Hunter squadrons demonstrated they had the measure of the Pakistanis in tactics as well as skill, although they were not yet in the missile age. Pakistani fighters were using American Sidewinder missiles, both F-104 starfighters, but also many of their Sabres. There was no dearth of courage ever. One story you can reconstruct with pride is of an audacious plan to lure out the Sabres into combat after the very first loss of the four vampires. By this time, the IAF presumed that the PAF was greedy over the prospect of shooting slow-moving vampires. They sent out a formation of slow and large Mysteer aircraft led by Wing Commander W.M. Goodman as decoys or as a bait to lure the Sabres, with squad leader Johnny Green's formation of 6 Nats lurking behind them. Sure enough, the Sabres took the bait and gave the IAF its first 2 successes of that war, even as the Mysteers exited safely. But overall in that war, the PAF had greater sway over the skies in daytime. And at night, they pretty much had a free run as the IAF fighters were not night capable in 1965. That's the reality. In nearly 60 years yet, the IAF and the defense establishment have avoided facing that truth. This in spite of the fact that 1971 marked the IAF's finest hour, where the IAF attacked relentlessly, never suffered a setback, and never yielded the PAF any space. Now, the fact is that I'm blessed to be able to tell you a story, a brilliant story to conclude this very unusual episode of Cut The Clutter. This is about then Wing Commander MST, or nicknamed Molly Wallen. He was then commanding the still forming MiG-21 squadron. In that war, I told you, our MiG-21 squadron was still half formed. It was only half strength, only 9 aircraft had come in, 2 had got hit in that Pathankot raid. He had the mortification. Molly Wallen had the mortification of seeing his MiG blown up on the ground at Pathankot, even as he jumped into a water tank in full flying livery to duck the strafing Sabres. Earlier, he had fired both his missiles at a Pakistani Sabre from an impossible angle and ruled the fact that the first MiGs, the first version of MiGs that the IAF had received, did not have any cannons, any guns on them. So he had the Sabre in his range but didn't have a gun. He could only fire the missiles, both his missiles, from an impossible angle, so he had missed. I had the privilege. I was privileged to have a conversation with Molly Wallen in Shillong in 1982. As an Air Marshal now, he was commanding the Eastern Command of Indian Air Force, headquartered in Shillong. A couple of new books had just been published on the Air War of 1965, notably John Fricker's very loaded, very pro-Pakistani account, and I asked him what went wrong in the Air War in 1965. Air Marshal Wallen spoke with honesty not common to Indian military establishment. He said, of course, things had gone wrong. And he said that we had analyzed why. Why, he asked, did some squadrons with the same aircraft do very well and some poorly? That's because a fighting squadron, he said, is just about 16 pilots. In any group of 16 people, he said, you would find a few that would be totally fearless, that would not have known the word fear. In their company then, these will be fearless and competent pilots. In their company then, there will be many who will become fearless just because they are in the same company. And the rest who would then be simply positively overwhelmed by this peer pressure. The IAF realized, he said in that conversation, that in the rush of the post-1962 expansion, its fighter squadrons were not properly balanced. Some had too many of his first category and did brilliantly, and some had too few and did poorly. On that cold Shillong evening, I learned a lesson in leadership and team management as relevant to our humdrum civilian lives as to the military. The key to success lies in distributing the best people evenly amongst all your teams. Post-1965, the IAF addressed this, and the history of 1971 war in the air therefore was entirely different. I know you will ask me where is a lot of this data and this detail coming from, this history coming from, so I would recommend 2 books to you. On the 65 Air War and then 71 Air War, although regrettably, the book on the 71 Air War only talks about the eastern sector. That book, the 1971 War book, was published by HarperCollins in 2013. Both books are written by the same authors, P.V.S. Jaganmohan and Samir Chopra. The 1965 book was published by Manohar. As a big and powerful country now, we can be large-hearted and open-minded enough to look at our own military history more dispassionately by reading books like these and other such honest accounts that are available on our site. Leave the Pakistanis, meanwhile, to build their mythologies, to perpetuate them, and also to keep debating whether it was a defeat for them or a defense for them. Definitely one thing they can't claim is that it was a victory for them.